Hello, this is Graham from Grahamophones. I've got with me the Garrard number 14 motor that came out of the Decca 120 that I was recently given. I'm going to do some cleaning up of it. I'm going to strip it down and service it, and that will include taking apart the case. And because the spring case on this is another tricky one, not as tricky as the HMV that I demonstrated on my first video, where we have a spring clip holding the lid on, but nevertheless it does come with its problems. Anyway, the first thing I'm going to do is pull this to pieces, so as soon as I've done that I'll be back with you.
Here's the motor now in pieces. Notice on the base plate, top right, you can just see the end of a bearing sticking out. I'll leave that in there and it will explain later why. Here's the actual spring case. Not too bad. There's quite a bit of dirty old grease underneath the cog there. Here are all the parts cleaned up. Notice I've left the winding shaft in place of the base plate. There's no point in just taking things off for the sake of taking them off, but do be careful with any small parts that are contained in there. You'll see there are 3 washers in the plate at the top, and on the right hand, bottom right hand spindle is a small ball bearing that mustn't be lost. Now, taking the case apart, I tap onto that edge and gradually work round until I've got the lid loose. I don't usually hold it like that. I've held it like that for clarity, but you can basically see how I would approach it. When I do the job, I've got my hand right round it, supporting the back, so I'm kind of hitting into my hand, and gradually working around, just tapping usually frees it, unless it's really seized on, in which case you would need to use penetrating oil.
Okay, so now you can see the spring case is loose. There's old grease in there. The grease in these motors isn't generally too bad, but what I'm going to do now is go ahead and take out that spring, clean it off, re-grease it, and then put the lid back on. Now, the removal of the spring is basically like the one shown in the HMV motor video, with the exception that I'm going to have this lid attached all the time. But basically I will just go in there with my wooden peg, lever out those first few coils, and then remove that spring in exactly the same way as I remove the HMV one. It will be fitted just like the HMV one, with a keyhole that goes onto the other end of that spigot there that you can see. Right, well, I'll go ahead and do that. Take out the spring, clean it, re-grease it, put it all back together again, and then we'll be ready for putting the motor back together.
So here we are with the spring removed from its case. Not too bad, just a yucky brown colour. I cleaned all that off and re-greased it, and here you can see the spring case and the spring ready for assembling, just as we've reassembled the HMV motor in the first video.
Hello again. Well, here we are. Here's the clean spring case with the spring in position, the cap back, all greased and clean and ready to go back in the motor. I've checked all around to make sure that this cap is squarely seated on the base and that I've got the correct amount of spindle coming through the case at the bottom. So that's now clean and ready to go back in the motor. Right, so that's the spring case out of the way. Now it's a case of reassembling the motor. What I'm going to do first of all is add the governor armature. Now, I mentioned when we were looking at the stills that I leave one bearing in place. There it is. It's the bearing that's protruding through the pillar the shortest amount. That's simply so that by taking the one that protrudes the furthest through the pillar, I'm gaining a little bit more space in which to manipulate the armature out of its location. The reason I leave one in, as I've mentioned on the website, is because the speed is going to be set by the relationship between the pad and the disc. And in order to maintain that relationship in the position it was before, assuming it was running okay before, if we leave one bearing in place, then that is going to act as a reference point. Anyway, time to put this bearing back. Do be careful with these bearings. They contain a small ball bearing that sits, I don't know if you can see that, in that hole. And they tend to be held in position by the oil that's in there, but they can come out. In fact, some people actually soak those in paraffin overnight and remove those bearings. I don't. I work on the premise that those bearings are probably well oiled anyway, and I just know that if I go and take that ball bearing out, I will lose it. So I'm just going to fix that in position. There we go. You can see what I mean. That bearing protrudes through that pillar quite an amount, about 5mm, so that gives you an extra bit of play there. And there we go. That will be adjusted later on. So the next thing that I'm going to put on is going to be the turntable spindle. Now do take care with the turntable spindle. Both the Garrard one and the HMV one have a ball bearing, and it's there. You see? I've got it on a magnetic screwdriver. It sits in the end of that shaft. Sometimes it may be on the end of the shaft, more often than not, but sometimes it may also be contained in that little copper, I don't know what you'd call it, that little copper pot there. In the Garrard and the HMV ones, it usually sits in there and stays in there. Again, it's one of those components in a motor dismantling that you do need to be aware of. So I'm going to pop my finger over the end of that. Over this side goes a thin washer that sits in there, and then that can be popped through the hole in that allows the spindle to go through for the turntable, and there we go, that's in position. The next thing I'm going to do is put the motor on, sorry, the spring on, and before I do that I'm just going to add a bit of grease around the winding mechanism, and then that, so just pop a bit of grease where that's going to go through the location there, and drop the spring case in. Now onto the spring case goes yet another washer. I'm going to add a little bit of grease around that area, and then there we go, that's in place. And the last component to go in is going to be the intermediate gear. Now this also has a little washer that fits on that end. You can just pop a bit of grease on there so that doesn't fall off, and that goes into the last remaining hole on the motor, which is there. So there we go, everything is back. It's just waiting for the base plate, and I'm just going to, we'll actually be oiling this, but I'm just going to put a little bit of grease on the end of that turntable spindle just to make sure that doesn't decide to go walkabout while I'm fitting the base plate. Here we go. This is sometimes a little bit tricky, just lining up the holes. Usually once everything's in alignment it clicks into place as it did there, and then we can add one wee bit stiff for some reason. There we go. Right, so there we've got everything now back together. So there's our motor back together again. Just one major check really to do first of all, and that's concerned with that governor armature. I just want to make sure that that is freely moving. It can catch on the brass gear there on the turntable spindle, and it can catch either at the bearing end or at the end of that governor assembly, but that seems to be working okay. So we're now ready to go to the next stage of calibrate, which is to calibrate the speed. Now the first thing that I'm going to do, and I'll try and put this so you can see in the video, is this assembly here running from that spindle down to the pad. That is what we're ultimately going to be moving when we control the speed on the motor board. The arm that comes out there that points to 78 actually moves that spindle. And what I want to do first of all is to make sure that that pad and spindle are at the central point of their movement. If you look under here, you will see there is a hole in this instance with a little lug that comes into that, it's bent off that assembly, and that's in the middle. So it means that when that spindle is turned, I've got a certain amount of movement forwards and backwards to adjust. I want that in the central position first. Now the next stage isn't recommended really at all. In fact, Eric Rice in his book The Complete Talking Machine says under no circumstances do this. And really what I'm talking about is setting the speed by loosening the two bearings. Now because I left one bearing in place, that one at that end, I have a reference point, as I mentioned earlier, that allows the location of that armature to be approximately right to start with. And in fact, if that is the case, if you've done that, you may not need to do this stage. I sometimes do it just to make absolutely sure, but what I'm going to do is, as I say, not altogether recommended if things go astray and you lose control over those bearings and the armature comes out. There is nothing to stop that motor, that spring in that motor completely unwinding. However, what I do is this: I fix the turntable spindle up with a strobe disc. There we go. A strobe disc, for those people who don't know, is this disc with the marks on, and when we look at that disc under a tungsten light source, when the speed is right, in our case at 78 RPM, those marks will appear to be stationary. So what I do is give the, I'm not going to do this now because it's pretty tricky with operating the video and doing this, so I'll just explain it. I give the motor about a dozen winds, and then I loosen off the two set screws just a little bit, that will allow me slight movement of that armature by pressing either way or the other. And while I'm doing that, I'll look at the strobe, and when that strobe appears stationary, when I've got about 78 RPM, actually not quite, when it's moving slightly forward so that I've got in advance of 78 RPM, I then lock off those two bearing set screws. Now, having done that, the final stage is that coming to the bearing at this end, I slacken that off again and just give that armature a little bit of relief and play by easing that bearing out. I do that one and not that one because the spindle is moving clockwise, so the gear on the spindle is wanting to push the worm gear on the armature into that bearing. If I loosen that with the intention of getting some play, all I'm doing is allowing that armature to move further into that bearing or away from that pad, and therefore all it's going to do is increase the speed. So once the speed is set, that's the bearing we release. So now the motor is back underneath the motorboard and everything's connected. I've temporarily connected the control arm there and the speed indicator to the spindle so that I can adjust that, and that's what I'm going to be doing now. I'm going to first of all take a reading to see what speed we've actually got at the spindle at the moment. And we've got a speed there of 74.2. So I'm going to adjust the controller in the direction of the fast mark and take another reading. This time I'm at 77. Just dropped to 76. So I'm going to up it a little bit more. I'm looking for a reading at this stage of around about 79.80, because by the time I've got the turntable on, that will cause a little bit of drag, and I'm basically there. Look at that, we've got a reading now of 79.8 at the on the digital tachometer. And as I look at the plate here, the indicator is actually, as luck would have it, pointing to 78. So in other words, when I've got the turntable on there, with that turntable in position and with the record on and drag, it should pull it back a little bit. I could well have 78. So I'm basically happy with that, so I'm going to leave that at that stage. Had this been wildly out, the pointer wildly out, the speed there is okay at 79. I'd have just undone the little adjuster screw there and moved that arm in whichever direction I needed to in order for that pointer to point to 78 when I've got a speed of about 79.80 at the turntable spindle. Okay, so there we go. The Garrard 14 is now fully serviced, adjusted, and back in the Deca 120, ready hopefully to give me many more years good service. Two things before we leave it. The first is to say you didn't see me check the speed of the turntable when it's under load with the record on and the sound box in place. That's because I don't really feel that stage is necessary. I was quite happy with the speed of the spindle and the position of the controller on the speed indicator. So that's, as far as I'm concerned, the final stage. Any further adjustment of speed when a record is playing, I will do on a basis of what my ears tell me, rather than what a tachometer or a strobe disc tell me. The second point, before we leave, is to mention the difficulties of the governor armature. Two things here. First of all, it doesn't take much lateral movement before you start finding that the disc end of that armature contacts the spindle gear, and similarly the bearing on that side, if it's pushed too far through, will start to impede that that spindle gear. There's not a great deal. So when the motor has been set up and assembled, reassembled after servicing, do make sure that that governor armature is spinning freely and is not making any contact there. The second thing about the governor armature is to say that the way I adjust it is not recommended practice. To be honest, I've not found recommended practice for any of what I've shown you. It's all based on common sense and getting bits of information here and there. However, with the governor armature, it is worth mentioning that could potentially is a dangerous stage. The way I do it, by releasing the set screws and then moving those two bearings and therefore the armature slightly backwards and forwards, is not without its dangers. That armature, should it come free from those bearings, will allow the spring in the spring case to uncoil at a rapid rate of knots, and that, if it doesn't cause damage to the person doing the servicing, will certainly damage the teeth of the various gears connected. So not necessarily recommended, that one. But I must admit I do it and will continue to do it because I find it an effective way of setting that speed. However, if anyone's got an alternative that is safer, in fact, if anyone's got any information about any of the servicing that you've seen on the video that could be done better or safer or whatever, please do let me know at www.grahamophones.co.uk. The address is in the panel below. And I'd love to hear from you. In the meantime, I hope you've enjoyed the video. I hope you found various parts of it useful, and I hope maybe you'll come back and see me some more sometime. Thanks for watching. Bye bye now.